So the front. What is the front? So what I want to talk about now is essentially the combat front direction. So which is pretty much the first and most important step to sort of understanding battlefield layout. So let's talk about what this concept is. So here we have the player in cover here fighting against a number of different enemies. So this environment in particular is set up supporting a battle that is fought back and forth, across this line right here. So this is where everyone's eyes are sort of pointing. The enemy are shooting this way, the player is shooting this way, and each side is trying to sort of advance on the other side by moving along this vector. And so both the player and the enemy sort of move towards each other, and this as you can see, sort of the player is sort of able to, we move laterally in order to stay in cover, in order for us to move slowly sort of against the enemy position. So this environment, the way that things are set up, does not support combat in this direction. However, things may eventually sort of break down in the heat of the moment, or maybe after you kill maybe two of them or something like that. And you might end up with some fighting that's sort of going in this direction at some point or another. But, it's not comfortable. It's against the grain, so to speak. So along the front vector, the player can advance either wholly or partially occluded. The risks are mitigated. So cover allows this sort of like lateral movement as you sort of move forward. However, if we were to sort of switch the battlefield this way and to force it to work like this and try to make it to work, you can see sort of, let's see, so we're trying to force sort of the front direction to be this way despite the way the cover is. You can see sort of how awkward and dangerous the player's connections between cover are, and why combat doesn't really naturally work along this front vector. So the front vector, what determines this? Obviously, we're seeing some how cover placement is doing this. So the front vector is determined by cover orientation, as I showed, sort of like as sort of essentially cover is sort of in alignment on almost the opposite of, let's see if we go back to here, cover is placed sort of in these perpendicular to the front vector. Cover interaction, so the connections that you're able to make between cover positions, moving laterally, those sort of support mitigating risk. Enemy and player positions, so the enemy's on one side and they're trying to get to the player, and the player's on one side moving to the other. So that's the goal that you're moving back and forth, is along sort of that front vector. And of course entrances and exits, which will introduce new enemies, or or essentially, whereas the player's entrance into the space is from sort of one side, and then you move along the front vector in order to get to a goal space. So, so in the previous example, the front direction, as was defined by any enemy and cover placements, and it supports sort of entrances and exits like this, as you can see. So the player might come in here, they've got their goal, they need to move along it to sort of get to the goal, and the enemies are basically the antagonism that are keeping you from that position. So you need to sort of move carefully and laterally in order to eventually advance, shoot the enemies, and move out of the room. So what happens if we were to actually open up a door here? Now this opens up a possibility that enemies could potentially come from this direction, and now the player, his position or her position is uncovered here, and so that this cover right here doesn't really support combat in this along this front direction. So what we need to do here is to adjust this. So here, maybe we would want to have another cover right here in alignment with this door. So and maybe take sort of that high cover that was back here and move it sort of diagonal. So now it supports a front direction along here, but it also supports sort of a miniature front direction here. So now what we have here is a room that most of the space has it supports this sort of lateral movement in order to eventually move along the front vector. And then in this corner of the room, we have an area where the front essentially allows for lateral movement along these lines. So sort of, as you can see, perpendicular to the sort of dominant front vector that's in this room. So what this means is that we now have allowed player and enemy the possibility here of protected movement along these lines, and essentially in the direction of the dominant front vector. So as you can see, let's see. So as an example, this enemy right here can now move forward, relatively protected by the enemy from the player, because they have this position right here, this cover occlusion, and then they can get into cover here and be occluded from the enemy. And so now they'd be in a good position to negate the enemy or the player's cover position. So this is essentially what is called flanking. So we've designed this battlefield now to with what is known as a flank route. So the player's position is now negated, and they must scramble in order to find a better position to survive, or they need to retreat completely. So the player should have seen this and maybe anticipated it. Maybe they should have protected their right side as this enemy maybe crossed this gap, but now it's too late. Or maybe the player should have actually used this flank route on their own. So that is essentially how front direction can shift from one space to another. All right, so now let's move on to the battlefield as a whole.